The March air in Washington, D.C. carried a chill that seemed to seep into Brad Bishop's bones as he walked out of the State Department building for the last time. His colleagues saw a well-dressed diplomat heading home early, complaining or feeling unwell. None of them could have imagined that within hours, 5 people would be dead, and one of America's most baffling fugitive cases would begin. William Bradford Bishop Jr. had always been the golden boy. Born in sunny Pasadena, California in 1936, he grew up in a world that seemed tailored for success. His mother, Lobelia, had given him a name that carried weight, and his father had provided the kind of stable, middle-class foundation that bred confidence. Brad excelled at South Pasadena High School, where he met a pretty girl named Annette Weiss, who would become his high school sweetheart and eventually his wife. Yale University beckoned next, and Brad answered the call with the same easy grace he brought to everything else. Walking across that prestigious campus, he absorbed not just knowledge, but the unshakable belief that the world was his oyster. He graduated in 1959 with a bachelor's degree, though accounts differ on whether it was in history or American studies. What mattered wasn't the specific field, but the pedigree. Yale men were destined for great things. Annette waited for him, and they married shortly after graduation. The young couple embodied the American dream of the late 1950s. He was handsome, educated, and ambitious. She was beautiful, devoted, and ready to build a life together. They settled into married life with the expectation that success would follow naturally. Brad's first career move took him into the United States Army, where he spent 4 years in counterintelligence work. The experience suited his analytical mind and gave him skills that would prove valuable throughout his life. More importantly, it fed his love of languages and international intrigue. He had a gift for linguistics, becoming fluent in Italian, French, Spanish, and Serbo-Croatian alongside his native English. These weren't just academic achievements, but tools that opened doors to a world beyond America's borders. When his military service ended, the State Department welcomed him into the Foreign Service. This was the career he'd been preparing for without realizing it, a perfect blend of his intellectual interests, language skills, and desire to see the world. Annette supported the decision, perhaps not fully understanding that diplomacy would mean years of living far from home, in countries where English wasn't the primary language, and American customs seemed foreign. Their first major posting took them to Italy in 1968, where Brad would spend the next 4 years living in the romantic cities of Verona, Milan, and Florence. For a young American couple, it seemed like a fairy tale. Brad thrived in the diplomatic environment, handling complex negotiations and building relationships with Italian officials. He even pursued postgraduate work at the University of Florence, adding to his already impressive academic credentials. Ned tried to embrace the expatriate lifestyle, but the constant moves and cultural adjustments proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. She was raising their children, 3 sons who came in quick succession, in a foreign country, often relying on Brad's language skills to navigate even simple daily tasks. The boys, however, adapted with the resilience of youth, picking up bits of Italian and treating their European childhood as an adventure. The family's next adventure took them even further from home. In 1972, Brad received postings in Africa, first to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, then to Gaborone, Botswana. For Brad, these assignments represented the kind of challenging, high-stakes diplomacy he craved. Africa in the 1970s was a continent in transition, with new nations finding their footing and Cold War tensions playing out in regional conflicts. An American diplomat in Ethiopia or Botswana wasn't just filing reports. He was helping shape policy that could affect millions of lives. But for Annette, Africa represented isolation from everything familiar. The climate was harsh, medical care was limited, and the cultural differences were even more pronounced than they had been in Italy. She found herself increasingly homesick, longing for the stability of American suburbia, where she could raise her children without worrying about political upheaval or tropical diseases. The boys were growing up as true third-culture kids, equally at home in American embassy compounds and local markets, but perhaps never fully belonging to either world. At ages that should have been spent playing Little League Baseball and attending American schools, they were navigating the complexities of diplomatic life, learning to adapt to new countries every few years. By 1974, even Brad was ready for a change. The family returned to Washington, D.C., where he took a position at State Department headquarters as an assistant chief in the Division of Special Activities and Commercial Treaties. It was a significant role, one that suggested his career was on an upward trajectory. They settled in Bethesda, Maryland, an affluent suburb that attracted diplomats, government officials, and other professionals who worked in the nation's capital. The house in Bethesda represented everything they'd worked toward. It was spacious enough for their growing family. The three boys were now teenagers and preteens, and located in a neighborhood where diplomatic families were common. Brad's mother, Lobelia, had moved in with them, creating a multi-generational household that seemed to embody stability and success. From the outside, the Bishop family looked like they had achieved the American dream with an international twist. Brad was a respected diplomat with an impressive resume. Annette was a devoted wife and mother, and their three sons were bright, well-traveled young men with promising futures. Neighbors saw them as the kind of family that belonged in Bethesda, educated, well-mannered, and successful. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Brad found himself chafing at the desk job after years of hands-on diplomatic work overseas. He missed the excitement and importance of his foreign postings, where he had felt like he was making a real difference. The bureaucratic routine of Washington headquarters felt stifling after the dynamic challenges of representing America in Italy and Africa. Annette, meanwhile, was trying to reclaim her own identity after years of being primarily defined as a diplomat's wife. She had enrolled in art classes at the University of Maryland, pursuing interests that had been put on hold during their years abroad. For the first time in their marriage, she was asserting some independence, making decisions about her time and energy that didn't revolve entirely around Brad's career and their children's needs. The financial pressures were mounting too. Living in Bethesda wasn't cheap, and maintaining the lifestyle expected of a successful diplomat required careful budgeting. While they weren't facing poverty, the easy prosperity of Brad's early career had given way to the reality of supporting a family of 6 on a government salary in an expensive area. Most troubling of all, both Annette and Lobelia had begun to voice concerns about Brad's career trajectory. The promotion he'd been expecting hadn't materialized, and for the first time in his charmed life, Brad was facing the possibility that his natural talents and impressive credentials might not be enough to guarantee continued success. The golden boy was discovering that even golden boys could stumble. Winter gave way to spring in 1976. These tensions were building toward a crisis that none of them could have anticipated. Brad's colleagues at the State Department saw him as the same competent, well-dressed diplomat he'd always been. His neighbors in Bethesda saw a successful family man with a beautiful wife and 3 promising sons. Even his own family couldn't have imagined what was brewing beneath his calm exterior. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shatter not just one family, but the assumptions of everyone who thought they knew William Bradford Bishop, Jr. March 1st, 1976 started like any other Monday at the State Department. Brad Bishop arrived at his office in Foggy Bottom, wearing his usual professional attire, carrying his briefcase, and greeting colleagues with the same courteous manner they'd come to expect. But something was different that morning, though no one could pinpoint exactly what. The news came during a routine meeting. The promotion Brad had been counting on, the one that would validate his years of service and expertise, had gone to someone else. In the sterile conference room where such decisions were announced, Brad received the news with the same diplomatic composure he'd cultivated over years of representing American interests abroad. He nodded, thanked his superiors for their consideration, and returned to his office. The secretary noticed the change immediately. Brad, who was usually meticulous about his work and maintained strict professional standards, seemed distracted and agitated. When she asked if he was feeling all right, he mentioned feeling unwell and said he needed to leave early. It was unusual behavior for a man who prided himself on dedication and reliability. Roy Harrell, a colleague who had worked with Brad in various capacities over the years, encountered him outside the State Department building that afternoon. What he saw troubled him enough that he would remember it clearly for decades afterward. Brad appeared agitated in a way that was completely out of character. The usually composed diplomat seemed to be struggling with some internal turmoil that he couldn't or wouldn't share. After leaving the State Department, Brad's movements became a carefully orchestrated sequence that would later be reconstructed by investigators. His first stop was his bank, where he withdrew several $100s in cash. The teller remembered the transaction not because of the amount, but because of Brad's demeanor. He seemed nervous, distracted, checking his watch repeatedly as if operating on some invisible schedule. From the bank, Brad drove to Montgomery Mall, a typical suburban shopping center where families came to buy everything from groceries to sporting goods. But Brad wasn't shopping for his family's everyday needs. He purchased a ball-peen hammer and a gas can, items that would have seemed innocuous to the store clerk, but were actually components of a plan that was taking shape in his mind. The gas station adjacent to the mall was his next stop. Brad filled the gas can and topped off the tank of his 1974 Chevrolet station wagon. The attendant remembered him as polite but quiet, paying cash and declining any small talk. Brad was operating with the methodical precision he'd learned in his military and diplomatic training, but now those skills were being applied to something far removed from counterintelligence or treaty negotiations. His final shopping stop was a hardware store, where he purchased a shovel and pitchfork. The store employee who helped him would later recall that Brad seemed to know exactly what he wanted, asking no questions about different models or prices. He paid cash, loaded the tools into his station wagon, and drove away without looking back. By the time Brad arrived at his Bethesda home that evening, probably between 7:30 and 8 p.m., his family was settling into their usual Monday night routine. The boys were likely working on homework or watching television. Annette might have been preparing for her art classes or handling household tasks. Lobelia, Brad's mother, was probably walking the family dog, a routine she enjoyed that gave her some independence despite living in her son's home. Next in that comfortable suburban house would haunt investigators and the local community for decades. Police believe Annette was killed first, probably as she went about her evening activities, unaware that her husband of 17 years had returned home with murder on his mind. The woman who had supported his career, moved across continents with him, and raised their 3 children had no warning of what was coming. Lobelia likely died next, possibly as she returned from walking the dog. The elderly woman who had named her son William Bradford Bishop Jr. and watched him achieve success beyond her wildest dreams became his second victim. The dog, who would later be found with Brad, was apparently spared, though it witnessed horrors that no living creature should see. 3 boys, aged 5, 10, and 14, were killed as they slept in their upstairs bedroom. These children, who had experienced more of the world than most adults, who spoke fragments of multiple languages and had memories of Italian piazzas and African markets, died without ever knowing why their father had become their killer. Their dreams of growing up, perhaps following in their father's diplomatic footsteps or charting their own courses, ended in a suburban bedroom in Maryland. The house that had represented the Bishop family's success and stability became a crime scene. Blood spattered the front porch, the hallway, and the bedrooms where a family had lived, laughed, and planned for a future that would never come. The carefully maintained home in an upscale neighborhood became evidence of one man's complete psychological breakdown. But Brad's night was far from over. Using skills he developed during his diplomatic postings, he loaded the 5 bodies into his station wagon. The same vehicle that had carried his family on weekend trips and daily errands now became a hearse. He drove through the night, covering 275 miles from Bethesda to a remote, densely wooded swamp about 5 miles south of Columbia, North Carolina. The drive gave Brad hours to contemplate what he'd done, but there's no evidence that he considered turning himself in or seeking help. Instead, he seemed focused on the practical aspects of concealing his crimes. He drove through the darkness on highways he'd probably traveled during family vacations, past towns where American families were sleeping safely in their beds, carrying a cargo that would horrify anyone who discovered it. On March 2nd, in a swampy area far from civilization, Brad dug a shallow grave. The diplomat who had once negotiated treaties and represented American interests with dignity and skill was now reduced to digging in the mud with a shovel he'd purchased the day before. He piled the bodies of his wife, mother, and 3 sons into the hole, then doused them with gasoline from the can he'd bought at Montgomery Mall. The fire that consumed the Bishop family created smoke that attracted forest rangers, leading to the discovery that would launch one of America's most enduring fugitive investigations. Along with the charred remains, investigators found the gas can, pitchfork, and shovel with a partially legible label, reading OCH-HDW, later determined to reference Poach's Hardware, where Brad had made his final purchase before becoming a mass murderer. While authorities were still processing the horrific scene in North Carolina, Brad was already moving to the next phase of his plan. Later that same day, March 2nd, he appeared at a sporting goods store in Jacksonville, North Carolina, where he purchased tennis shoes. Witnesses remembered him because he had the family dog with him and was possibly accompanied by a woman described as dark-skinned, though her identity was never determined. For more than a week, Brad had a crucial head start while his crimes remained undiscovered. In Bethesda, neighbors began to notice that the Bishop house seemed unusually quiet, but it wasn't until March 10th that one of them contacted police. The family's absence had finally become concerning enough to warrant official attention. When a detective arrived at the Bishop residence, the evidence of violence was immediately apparent. Blood on the front porch, hallway floors, and bedroom walls told a story of horror that contrasted sharply with the home's affluent suburban setting. Dental records would later confirm what investigators already suspected. The bodies found in North Carolina belonged to Annette Bishop, Lobelia Bishop, and the 3 Bishop boys. March 18th, authorities had found Brad's abandoned station wagon at an isolated campground in Elkmont, Tennessee, in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The car was discovered just a few miles from the Appalachian Trail and about 400 miles from where his family had been buried. Inside, investigators found dog biscuits, a bloody blanket, a shotgun, an axe, and a shaving kit containing Brad's prescription medication. The trunk's spare tire well was full of blood, providing grim evidence of how the bodies had been transported. A witness believed the car had been abandoned sometime between March 5th and March 7th, giving Brad at least 3 days to disappear before his vehicle was discovered. Police theorized that he had joined the flow of hikers on the Appalachian Trail, using his outdoors experience and physical fitness to blend in with legitimate backpackers. They attempted to track him using bloodhounds, but the trail had gone cold. On March 19th, a grand jury indicted William Bradford Bishop Jr. on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The Golden Boy, who had seemed destined for diplomatic success, was now one of America's most wanted fugitives. The question that would haunt investigators for decades had already formed. How does a respected diplomat and devoted family man become a killer? And where does such a man run when he's destroyed everything he once held dear? The search for William Bradford Bishop Jr. began immediately after his indictment, but investigators quickly realized they were dealing with no ordinary fugitive. This wasn't a desperate criminal fleeing in panic. This was a trained intelligence officer with language skills, international experience, and possibly a diplomatic passport. The very qualities that had made him successful in his career now made him one of the most elusive fugitives in American history. FBI profiler John Douglas, who would later become famous for his work on serial killer cases, was brought in to develop a psychological profile of Bishop. What he found was deeply troubling. Unlike many family annihilators who kill in a moment of rage and immediately surrender or commit suicide, Bishop had planned his escape meticulously. The shopping trip for tools, the withdrawal of cash, the careful disposal of bodies, everything suggested a man who intended to survive and remain free. Douglas noted that Bishop's background gave him significant advantages over typical fugitives. His years in counterintelligence had taught him how to avoid detection and assume false identities. His diplomatic experience meant he understood how international borders worked and had contacts around the world. Most importantly, his fluency in 5 languages would allow him to blend into European populations in ways that monolingual Americans never could. The investigation revealed disturbing details about Bishop's mental state in the months before the murders. He had been taking Cerix, a medication for depression and anxiety, suggesting he was struggling with psychological issues that his colleagues and family either hadn't recognized or had chosen to ignore. His physician's records showed a man battling insomnia and depression, though nothing that would have predicted mass murder. More puzzling were the financial investigations. While some sources suggested the family was experiencing mild financial stress, typical of upwardly mobile suburban families, others hinted at more serious problems. Reports surfaced that the Internal Revenue Service had been auditing the Bishop family's taxes, though the IRS never confirmed this. The question of whether financial pressure had contributed to Brad's breakdown remained unanswered. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that Brad had been corresponding with a federal prison inmate named Albert Kenneth Bankston at the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. The nature of their relationship remained unclear: how they had met, why they were writing to each other, and what they discussed. Brad had instructed Bankston to send letters to his State Department office address, suggesting he wanted to keep the correspondence secret from his family. Bankston had mailed a letter to Brad 16 days after the murders, unaware that his correspondent had become a fugitive. The letter eventually found its way to investigators, but Bankston died in 1983, taking whatever secrets he might have known about Brad's state of mind to his grave. The connection raised troubling questions about whether Brad had been planning his crimes longer than anyone realized. As weeks turned to months and then years, reported sightings of Bishop began flooding in from around the world. The FBI took each report seriously, understanding that a man with Brad's skills and resources could indeed be living anywhere. The 3 most credible sightings became part of fugitive folklore, tantalizing glimpses of a man who seemed able to disappear and reappear at will. In July 1978, more than 2 years after the murders, a Swedish businesswoman reported seeing Bishop twice in a Stockholm park within a single week. She had worked with him during a business trip to Ethiopia and was absolutely certain of the identification. The sighting was particularly credible because she hadn't initially reported it. She didn't realize Brad was wanted for murder until later, when she saw his photograph in connection with the investigation. Stockholm sighting suggested that Brad was living relatively openly in Europe, confident enough to appear in public spaces where former colleagues might recognize him. It also indicated he might be using Sweden as a base of operations, taking advantage of that country's traditionally liberal policies toward political refugees and its large American expatriate community. Even more dramatic was the January 1979 encounter in Sorrento, Italy. Roy Harrell, the same State Department colleague who had last seen a distressed Brad outside their Washington office, was using a public restroom when he came face to face with a bearded man he immediately recognized. When Harrell asked, "Hey, you're Brad Bishop, aren't you?" the man responded in a distinctly American accent, "Oh no," and fled immediately. The Sorrento encounter was particularly significant because Harrell knew Brad well and had no reason to fabricate the story. The fact that the bearded man had responded in American English before fleeing suggested he was indeed Bishop, caught off guard by an unexpected encounter with someone from his past. Italy made sense as a hiding place. Brad spoke fluent Italian, had lived there for 4 years, and would have understood the culture and bureaucracy. The most recent credible sighting occurred in September 1994, nearly 2 decades after the murders. A former Bethesda neighbor was vacationing in Basel, Switzerland, when she spotted a well-groomed man she was certain was Bishop getting into a car at a train station. The long gap between sightings suggested that Brad had become more careful about appearing in public, but the Basel encounter indicated he was still alive and possibly still in Europe. These European sightings fit with investigative theories about Brad's likely survival strategy. FBI behavioral analysts believed he would try to live quietly in a country where his language skills and diplomatic experience would be assets. Switzerland, with its banking privacy laws and international community, would be an ideal location for someone trying to maintain a low profile while having access to sophisticated financial and communication networks. The investigation took a scientific turn in 2014 when the FBI exhumed the body of an unidentified man who had been killed by a car in Alabama in 1981. The victim bore a physical resemblance to Bishop and had died during the time frame when he might have returned to the United States. DNA testing definitively ruled out the connection, but the exhumation demonstrated how seriously authorities were taking even decades-old leads. Forensic advances also allowed investigators to debunk other supposed Bishop connections. Fingerprint analysis proved that reports of his death in Hong Kong or France were false, likely based on misidentifications of other American expatriates who had died abroad. Each false lead eliminated was one step closer to understanding where the real Brad Bishop might be hiding. In 2014, the FBI made Bishop one of their 10 most wanted fugitives, bringing renewed attention to a case that had never truly gone cold. Forensic artist Taryn Taylor created age progression sculptures showing what Bishop might look like in his late 70s, taking into account natural aging, possible surgical alterations, and lifestyle changes. The sculptures depicted a distinguished elderly man who could easily blend into retirement communities or expatriate circles. FBI's analysis suggested that by 2014, Bishop was probably hiding in plain sight somewhere in the United States, having returned from his European sojourn to live quietly under an assumed identity. The theory was that he was avoiding any situation that might require fingerprinting, employment that required background checks, driver's license renewals in some states, or any arrest, no matter how minor. The most shocking development came in March 2021, when a woman who had been adopted contacted authorities through a DNA testing service. She had discovered through genetic genealogy that William Bradford Bishop Jr. was her biological father. The FBI confirmed the relationship, proving that Brad had fathered a child either before or after the murders, though the circumstances remained unclear. This revelation opened new questions about Brad's life, both before and after 1976. Had he had an affair that his family never knew about? Had he somehow started a new family while living as a fugitive? The adopted daughter's existence suggested that Brad's secret life might have been more complex than anyone had imagined. Today, more than 45 years after the murders, William Bradford Bishop Jr. remains one of America's most wanted fugitives. He would be in his late 80s if still alive, an elderly man carrying the weight of 5 murders and decades of hiding. The case has inspired books, television documentaries, and countless amateur investigators who study every detail, looking for the clue that might finally solve the mystery. The Bishop case represents something uniquely American, the dark side of the suburban dream, and the terrifying possibility that the most respectable citizens might be capable of unthinkable crimes. It reminds us that intelligence, education, and social status provide no immunity against mental breakdown and violence. Somewhere, perhaps in a small town where he's lived quietly for decades, or in a foreign city where he's built a new identity, or in a grave that investigators haven't yet discovered, William Bradford Bishop Jr. carries the answer to one of America's most enduring mysteries. Until that answer is found, the golden boy who became a killer remains a ghost, haunting both those who knew him and those who have dedicated their lives to bringing him to justice. The perfect life that turned dark on a March night in 1976 continues to cast shadows across American criminal history, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous fugitives are those who seem least likely to run. Thank you for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and see you in the next one.